So the Manchester Marathon 2024 is on Sunday, April the 14th. I think by the time you watch this, it probably might have started. It starts at 9 o'clock. So Nick Bester here is going for yet another attempt at a sub 220 marathon. Will he do it this time? I've covered his training in a few previous videos, so I thought I'd had another go to see what I can see this time. And also my own coach, Matt Rees here, the Welsh runner, he's also running, is also in the elite wave. Not entirely sure what his target is, but I would say he's going for a PB, which would be a 224, something like that. And also, to contrast, we've got the running Brooms, John Broom and his wife Dawn Broom. Both of them are also running. They are perhaps sort of my older slightly vintage. I think John's about 53, Dawn's just turned 60. John's going for about 3:15, so he says, and Dawn's hoping to break 3:30. So let's have a look at their training in a bit more detail and see what we can see. Okay, so when I analyse the training of these people, I always like to do a summary. I always look to see how many miles per week they're running, what their longest run is, and also the proportion of their running, which is like harder. So this is like the overall summary. So what I've done, as I've done in previous times, I've looked at the 14 weeks prior to the actual marathon. So basically I've analysed the 13 weeks of proper training, and then I've ignored like the last week, this current week, as the taper week. So this mileage here is for the 13 weeks starting on the 8th of January going through to the 7th of April. So this is the amount of miles that these runners have done. So Nick Bester has done 1,151, by far the most amount of mileage, and then Matt Rees, the Welsh runner, 846, John Broom 757, Dawn 660, and that works out for Nick an average of 89, Matt 65, 58 for John and 51 for Dawn. And looking at their Strava for this year, I could work out what their average training pace is. So again, these sort of average training paces, you might think that they correlate quite well to their actual sort of targets and their ability. So Nick at 6:35 there, Matt at 7:11. I think it's interesting, when I did 2:33, my average training pace was quite similar to Matt there. And then Dawn and John, they do a lot of their running together, so not perhaps surprising that their average training pace is almost identical at just over a 9-minute miling, even though John is hoping to run a bit faster than Dawn. I think secretly he's hoping that he's going to beat Dawn. That remains to be seen. What I thought was very interesting is that the long run here, the longest run done by John and Dawn was in the Marriott's Way Marathon, which turned out to be a bit of a mudfest and took them about 5 hours because it was really, according to the video, really hard to run. I think it was more of a sort of a cross-country mud run than it was anything. But interestingly, Nick only did a long run this time of 22 miles and Matt 23. Both of those runs were kind of marathon-paced training sessions. So it's interesting to note they didn't do many time on feet long runs, but we'll come into that in a bit more detail. So what I've done for the total hard miles is worked out whenever they were running sort of close to marathon pace and faster, and total up those miles. So from that I was able to work out how close they fit to an 80-20 ratio, which is quite a common training theory. And interestingly, Nick, John and Dawn pretty much spot on the 80%. So Matt here at 68% is obviously doing slightly harder running, but we'll have a look to see how that compares to before. And looking at their prior tune-up races, all of them did a 5k or a half marathon, include park runs within the 5k. And all of these were quite solid times, actually. John's been desperately trying to break 20 minutes in the 5k for a long time and just came up short at 20:02. Dawn's there at 21:20. Nick's 14:38. It's just outside his PB. And Matt did a solid run in the Amar 5k, 15:05. Not quite his best, but good enough. But he did do a PB in the half marathon at 68:18. And Nick was a bit outside his best in the half marathon, but a solid 67:19 for him. I say solid, that's a lot faster than most of us would do, but I think maybe he was hoping for a bit faster. So in this one, I've added in analysis of the previous training blocks to see how they compare. So I first looked at Nick's training in Rotterdam 2022, also in Berlin 2022, and again in Berlin last year, and I've also done Matt twice before in Valencia 2022 when he did his PB, and also in Berlin as well. I haven't done John and Dawn before, but let's have a look at Nick first of all. I think that what strikes me here with Nick is very consistent training. He did the most amount of miles for his Rotterdam one here at 1181, but 1143, 1147, 1151. It's incredibly consistent, isn't it? And so you've got 91 miles, 88, 88, 89. So for argument's sake, he's running 90 miles a week, isn't he, for these blocks. And it's interesting that this time his average training pace was just slightly faster than it was before, not too much in it. And let's have a look at his 80-20 ratio. So it looks like this time he's actually gone slightly more aerobic, but very marginally. It's all hovering around about 80. Perhaps he did the most sort of like hardest work for his PB. So that's interesting actually that it's 73% there when he did the 228 PB. I'm not sure you can entirely correlate too much into that. He's sort of like worst in inverted commas race was his Berlin one last year, so I'm sure he'll be hoping to do better. Well, on the face of it, I think another interesting takeaway here is that his longest run was previously always 24.9. I think that's about 40k. This time he didn't go as far. And the same with Matt. Before he did his PB, he went out and ran a marathon race. I think it was Dublin. This time he didn't do that. So the biggest, longest run this time was 23. Although that's a bit longer than he did for Berlin, which didn't go very well. You see there, 2:31. So I'm not entirely sure what his goal is, but I've assumed that he's going to go for a PB, given his all-in mantra. And then Dawn and John, as you can see here, average miles per week, 58 for John, 51 for Dawn. So fairly similar. What's also interesting that their average of their hard miles is a lot lower. Obviously, they're running less mileage, but that means that they get a slightly higher 80-20 ratio. So a lot more sort of aerobic running, I would say. I think that perhaps reflects, discussing this with John, that obviously they're older. They both got full-time jobs, whereas Nick and Matt can both sort of get out whenever they really able to during the day. And obviously, being a lot older, as I know myself, you really have to sort of like be a bit cautious on the actual harder running. So have a look a bit more detail about all the weeks here. So this is in 3 sections. We've got the weekly miles here on the left. In the yellow here, we've got the longest run per week, and this is the number of harder miles. So I would say looking at Nick's average weekly mileage, if we take away that first week there when he only did 50, I mean, from then on, it was very, very consistent. Nick was always a very consistent trainer, a high mileage trainer. But what I also would notice that he does very few actually long time on feet runs at all. And this time he only actually went over 20 miles twice, which I think is interesting. I'm not quite sure if that is a good policy or not. I mean, when I was training for the marathon, I thought the long runs were really, really important. Maybe it's a more modern trend now for training to do a lot more sort of like harder work. And the 22 miles here, I've got to read some notes, that was comprised of 3 by 10k, and this one here was 4 by 5k. So these aren't, long runs like simulating how you do a race. And with Matt, he did more long runs. Interestingly, he did a 20-mile race there at 1:51, which is a good effort. And again, some of his ones there, 23 miles with 4 by 5k, then finishing off 2k even harder. And 20 miles there, 13 by 1k on and off. So effectively 26 Ks of hard running. And that one there was the only sort of like longest continuous run between the two of them, where he did 20 miles at a 5:55 pace. So that's sort of around about my PP pace, about 2:33 pace. So yeah, it's interesting to note. But the complete contrast to John and Dawn, all of their long runs, at least 20 milers here, with the exception of the Marriott's Way Marathon, were all basically time on feet runs. So they're always running them together. So they're doing these 20-mile runs most weeks that they aren't doing a race. And they threw in a couple of half marathons in there. That's where those 13s are. And I think they also had a 20-miler in there where they did about half it at marathon pace. So you could argue that that was similar to what Nick and Matt do. But interestingly, far more sort of emphasis on time on feet for John and Dawn. And also thought far less emphasis on sort of sessions. They didn't really do any sessions that were faster than marathon pace. Not I could obviously tell, but they do a lot of park runs and 5k. So you could argue that they had their sort of faster training stimulus from much more irregular exposure to park runs. And then you can see that in the harder miles there. Matt was the highest number of harder miles. And then John and Dawn obviously do a lot of the training together, very, very similar. So to give you an idea of the training of these people, let's just have a look at a random week here from Nick. I mean, one thing I did stress with Nick, he does an awful lot of like what I call like medium length runs. So a lot of runs which are over 10 miles. So this particular week, he had done a 10k in 32:03, which probably isn't that great for him, but yeah, solid run out. And you can see there that he actually ran 7 miles to the race and then 7 miles back home again. So that's quite a big session in a way. Perhaps I didn't really count that as a long run, which effectively it is, isn't it? And then you can just scroll down here, a bit of gym work, and yeah, this is an example of what I mean. 13.67 miles running, and then you see another 15 miles here, and another 13 miles. So you know, an awful lot of like long, medium length runs. I think that's very important for marathon training, and perhaps that's why you can get away with having not so many out and out really long time on feet runs. Here you see 17 miles with a session 15 by 1k. So he certainly does. Nick does train very, very hard. Here's another sort of over 10-mile run, 12.43 in Richmond Park. So let's have a look at one of Matt's weeks. This is one of his bigger weeks. It says it's 103.9 miles there, though they did include some cycling in there, which perhaps we should dwell on when we come to that. So you see an easy 7 miles here, but that was the day after this 20-mile run where he did it at 5:55 steady pace. So yeah, it's a very solid run. It's interesting they don't do too many of them. I'm interested to talk to them as to why they think that they need to do all the long runs as sort of like sessions in the main. And then they also do this club night with Kelly. I think some local friends do that. So sometimes Matt does this sort of hard, sometimes he just does it controlled. So you see there 10 by 2 minutes. And then there's Kelly with a few of these other people doing that. And then Matt's doing his bit of his double thresholds, I think. I'm not sure if he did one this week, but here we've got 8 steady, 3 up tempo. So that's sort of a Nick Bester 12-mile run with a bit of harder work in it. And then 10 miles there, heavy on the trails. And Nick, you might have seen, has just moved to Winchester. It's going to be a lot hillier than it is near Battersea Park. Here's the double threshold day. We've got 20 by 1 minute in the afternoon, and we've got in the morning 5 by 6 minutes. So yeah, Matt is quite keen on his double thresholds, but also interestingly here that he's still doing some quite hard biking. He's kind of eased off the biking in the last few weeks. He was doing an FTP test here, which is the equivalent of a lactate threshold test, which is one of the hardest things I think you could do in cycling, because it basically means you've got to go flat out for a period. And this looks like he did a 20-minute test there, where you basically go as hard as you can for 20 minutes, and he averaged 330 watts, and that gives him a FTP of 313, 4.2 watts per kilogram, which is a very solid cycling ability. So it'd be interesting to see if he'd ever actually take that outside and maybe do some duathlons. I think it could be quite good, but a bit of a niche event. I used to dabble in a bit, but yeah, not the most glamorous events perhaps. So yeah, interesting to see Matt. I think what I would say with Matt, his mileage seems to have dropped off slightly here towards the end. I'm not quite sure why that is. I'm not entirely clear whether he's got all his training runs covered here. I did notice that with John, and I had to speak to him, and he actually kindly uncovered some of them for me, so his mileages look better. But yeah, on the face of it, Matt says he doesn't do much mileage relatively, and I don't think he was injured this time or ill. I think he got ill around the time he had to move house about 6 weeks ago. But yeah, I'm interested to understand why his mileage dropped off there. The proof will be in the pudding in the race, wouldn't it, to see how he gets on. Whether it was just a sort of like a taper to make sure they had a bit of freshness in the legs. So let's have a look at a week from John Broom. I think John Broom is one of the YouTubers I emphasise the most, because he's probably the closest to me in age and the closest to me in kind of like trying to live off former glories but still keen. So yeah, this is a good example of what I mean here. This is a sort of run I would call a marathon training run that I was very keen on doing, like 20 miles where you had to sort of basically grind it out. Maybe you're feeling a bit tired, but you know, I also got a lot of benefit, I thought, from doing these long runs. Interestingly, the marathon marathon didn't go over 20, but he did lots of 20 miles. I think there was about 5 or 6 in there. It was like most weeks he wasn't doing anything else. They're also quite into Zwift on the treadmill, so a bit of extra miles there. Also very into their park runs. They don't always do them flat out, so Clumber Park run here, quite an easy one there for John, 8:39 pace. You got a decent warm up there, a bit more Zwift, a bit more Zwift, a bit more Zwift, a bit more Zwift. Maybe that was a bad weather week, and then getting miles done. Actually, oh, yeah, actually, look at this. He actually had an outdoor warm up to go and run some tempo miles on the treadmill, which is an interesting way of doing it. So between the two, they did about 10k there worth of work at sort of marathon pace, maybe a bit quicker than marathon, I think actually. And then another sort of time on feet run there for 8 miles. A few little runs here. A good midweek there of 10 miles. It was good to get 10 miles on the clock, I think. And a few training partners there. So with Dawn and Suzanne there. Another 5 miles. Looks like an old railway to me there. We're both into running on our railways. And a very easy recovery run, 9:42 pace. I think I would struggle to run that slowly. I think I would just sort of feel like I'm falling over myself. But yeah, good to know that you can actually run that easily when the time comes. See if we can find Dawn in the same week, 26th of February. So here we are. Here's Dawn. She is recently a W60. Hope you won't mind me saying that. But very strong running background, 2:56 marathon, which for a woman is a very fine performance for sure, and she's still running extremely well as a W60. If you get under 3:30, that will be a very good performance indeed. I noticed that she does a fair bit of walking, or at least includes it on Strava. So when I did the mileages, I took the walks out just to sort of like make it standardized. But having said that, I think that the walks perhaps are important for some minor aerobic benefit, but perhaps also like helping to reduce stiffness in the legs. I've noticed a bit when I've been very, very stiff. If I played golf in the morning and I wanted to do a session, sometimes I walk for a bit just to get a bit of loosening out of the legs. So here we are. Here's a run with John. Looks like 20 miles. And also sort of noting here that legs are a bit tired, but a sort of classic time on feet run, I'd say. And Dawn's also running the treadmill. Presumably they have to sort of like alternate between the two. Looks like Dawn did the part run with John that time. Fairly easy one there, and more Zwifting, a bit more walking, a bit more Zwifting, a bit more Zwifting, and a morning run warm up. Oh, there's a session going on here. Oh, tempo runs. So they both were doing sessions as tempo runs. So yeah, 7:30 pace for Dawn would be a very solid effort. Her marathon pace for sub 3:30 is sort of exactly 8-minute mile pace. So that's probably more like half marathon pace, maybe quicker than that. And yeah, some good solid miles here. Birthday social run. Not quite sure whose birthday that was. Was that her birthday? Happy birthday, Dawn. Yes, happy birthday. That must have been her 60th birthday run. So you celebrate, you go out for a run. Well, I can say that, didn't I? Because I did a 55k on my 55th birthday. I always make a point of going for runs. I usually have the day off work. And interesting bit of hill sprints here going on just to keep the legs turning over. Obviously, the marathon pace VO2 max sessions aren't necessarily all of the day, especially with people like John and Dawn, like me. They just have to be really careful that to push the boundaries. Solid aerobic running, I think, is the order of the day, and a couple of easy runs there also in that week. Okay, so if we go back to the chart, I don't really like to sort of say whether I think that these goals are realistic. I mean, obviously Nick is very consistent around 2:20, and Matt has had some very good marathons over the years, very experienced. I think John has sort of been training as well as he has done for a long time, and Dawn has also had a very solid period. Neither of them have been sort of like badly injured for a while. In fact, nobody had any really bad injuries or illnesses in this one. They obviously get the odd cold. I think Dawn lost a week for a cold. Matt lost a few days for a cold. But Nick, I think he had a bit of a sort of slight niggle for a few days. But other than that, very solid running. So I think there's every good chance that Nick could do 2020. If I was a betting man, I would probably think that, I don't know, it's going to be a really tough one. I mean, there's also think that he could do that. Matt, I just worry that he just sort of like the mileage has gone off a bit, so I'm hoping that he's knows what he's doing there and he's going to take things a bit more steadily in the first half and see if he can come through strongly at the end. And I think John and Dawn, I think both of those runners will start off steadily. I think for 3:15 may be a bit ambitious for John, but I think anything that's a solid run, I'm sure he'd be very pleased with. I think his number one criterion will be to finish this time, because his last marathon he didn't manage to do so. And Dawn, I think of the four, perhaps she's the most likely to meet her target. I would say perhaps she's the most sort of like experienced in terms of like knowing exactly what she's capable of doing. And let's hope they all have a good run. I did notice if you go to the manchestermarathon.co.uk website, they've got a live stream going on. I think it's on their YouTube channel Adidas Manchester Marathon YouTube channel. So if I think I'll be tuning into that, see what we can see, and you can also track your runners. So be sure to track all those 4. And is anyone else you know that's running it? And are you running the London Marathon, the Boston Marathon? These other 2 big ones coming up, isn't it? So are you doing any other marathons this time? I'm not. I'm more training for the 800 and 1500, and I'll have to do a video on how it's been going. Just getting some solid miles in at the moment. Did a session today, actually, 12 minutes, and then 5 by 2 minutes and 12 minutes. So more like a sort of like a marathon training than 800 meter training, but it's early days yet. It's only mid-April. One of my club mates, Yanni Craner, did a PB today of 2:11. So yeah, definitely need to find a race and start to see how I'm getting on. Okay, so I hope you found this interesting. Like and subscribe, all that, and see you on the next one. It's also a boom shakalaka. Give it a full send. It's an all-in, and it's a keep it on, isn't it?